Hey, Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Rakakwadash, the honors to the apostles and the elders, great millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Araquai, back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to go through an account that was spoken about in the book of Judith that's found in the Apocrypha. And I thought it was very, very interesting, with this particular account here, in regards to understanding essentially how the heathens think, right? And this is one of the things that they did back then, when we were being attacked by Nebuchadnezzar, who was one of the kings of originally the Assyrians, right? And basically how they gathered a lot of intel upon our people, and eventually they used as you will see further on within the book of Judith in the story, that they gathered not only intel to basically have us in separation between us and the Lord Yahweh Bashem Yahushai, because they understood that when we were transgressing against our power would essentially use the heathens, so using themselves to fight, to punish us. But when we were in tune with the Lord, when they understood that when we were in cohesion, in one mind towards actually pleasing the Lord and actually not doing the things Heavenly Father, that thought was detestable, or like the odious works that's described in Wisdom of Solomon. When we weren't doing those things, and actually doing the things that were more pleasing towards Him, that would lead to the Lord actually being a defense for us, right? And that's very, very powerful information, because Jake doesn't understand. They think of it, when they think about the law, statutes, and commandments, they think of it as something that is grievous. They don't think of it as something that is, as this is your protection, and the Lord actually being a battle axe, and I don't want to say it like that, but the Lord being a strong defense, for us, as opposed to, you constantly being plummeted, by the heathens. And that's something we still see to this day, right? With Trump and different ICE raids and so on and so forth, because our people are stubborn, right? So, I wanted to get a quick account, in the book here, and I thought it was very, very interesting. And I sincerely hope and pray that, that this lesson is truly edifying, right? I'll start off here just to establish some context. I want to read a bit of the second chapter and then read and go to the seventh chapter. This is Judith chapter 2. I'll start at verse 1, and I want to read down just a little bit just to get an idea of who we're dealing with here, because these are heathens that are seeking to try and take, us down at this time, right? And eventually you'll see throughout the story then, as the story continues, you see that there are different examples of opposition, towards, our people, right? So this is Judith chapter 2. This is verse 1 here, and it says, in the 18th year, the 20th day of the first month, there was a talk in the house of Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Assyrians, that he should, and he said, avenge himself of all the earth. So he called unto him all his officers and all his nobles, and commanded with them his secret counsel, and concluding the afflicting of the whole earth out of his mouth. Then they decreed to destroy all flesh that did not obey the commandment of his mouth. And when he had ended his counsel, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Assyrians, called Holofernes, the chief captain of his army, which was next to him, and said unto him, Thus saith the great king, the Lord of the whole earth, Behold, thou shalt go from my presence, and take thee men that trust in their own strength of the footmen, 120,000, and the number of horses with their riders 12,000. Right, so he appoints this guy named Holofernes to basically to carry out, his will. Okay, go and put these other lands and cities and all these other people in subjection. Right, he's in the mindset of conquering. So I want to jump over to the 7th chapter just to get an idea. So I just want to read that real quick. But the meat I really wanted to get into is in the 7th chapter, which something very interesting happens within this chapter here. So I'm going to read from verse 1 down to verse 17 here. Just so you can get an idea of what's actually one of the war tactics, I should say, that that the heathens employed to try and take us down. Right, this is very, very useful information, because it also, you can take this and understand that these different war tactics, these different heathens, they use these same war tactics today against our people. But our people are so destroyed for lack of knowledge, they don't see themselves in a sentiment of, well, this is actual warfare. Them putting forth different policies to, for example, destroy your families, to remove fathers out of the household, contaminate your food. Those are different examples of subtle yet powerful forms of warfare. But our people don't see it as that, because they think they think everybody's just like them, and they just so-called want to be equal, when they don't understand, number one, you are a holy people above the other nations, and then you being above the other nations, you have enemies. But our people don't understand that, because as the scriptures say, they're destroyed for lack of knowledge. Right, so I want to read this here. So this is Judith chapter 7, verse 1 here, and it says, "And the next day Holofernes commanded all his army and his people, and which were come to take his part, they should remove their camp against Bethulia, to take aforehand the ascent of the hill country, and to make war against the children of Israel." Right, so eventually at this point in the story, they spoke to this guy named Achior. And they found out, essentially the intel, like I just spoke about earlier, in regards to what's pleasing to our power. And they knew all the history. And that's very funny. When you go through that chapter, and specifically, they knew all the history about when the Lord fought for us in the time of Egypt. They knew they knew our history going back all the way to our forefather Abraham, and his father being an idol worshiper. They knew all those different accounts. And this is why our people don't seek to understand the value in knowing their history. They don't understand the value in knowing, who your power is. As a matter of fact, let me get a quick precept. I didn't have this written down, but this kind of just speaks to the sentiment that I'm conveying here. This is, one second. This is Isaiah chapter 1, verse 3. And it says, "The ox knoweth his owner, and the ass his master's crib. But Israel doth not know, my people doth not consider." Right? So, even the ass, the ass and the ox actually understand, they have an owner. They understand that, who feeds them. They understand. And even, it's crazy too. When you look at some animals, even though if the person doesn't own the animal, like when there's been several interactions of like, people that interact with animals, and after they save them or they save their young or they feed them, they always understood and they always came back to show some sentiment of gratitude, towards that person, whoever it was, right? But our people don't consider, that they're the people of the Lord. They don't understand the condition that they're in. They don't actually understand, why certain things happen to them, right? So they're very, they just don't consider, and they don't actually strongly care about their history, right? And the irony is when we're in Black History Month and so-called Black History Month, and they unless somebody's actually trying to put forth the helm to properly give them understanding, I don't want to say understanding, but so-called understanding through these different efforts that they like to do every year, that doesn't actually bring you closer to the Lord. The Lord uses his prophets to give you understanding. That's why the scriptures say, come ye to the waters and eat, and he that hath no money and wine and milk and buy, to roughly paraphrase, you know those things are valuable. Get understanding unto the nature of who you are, right? um I want to continue down in verse 2 here. So this is Judith chapter 7 verse 2, and it said, and then the strong men removed their camps in that day, and the army of the men of war were 170,000 footmen and 12,000 horsemen, beside the baggage, and the other men that were afoot among them were a very great multitude. And they camped in the valley near Bethulia by the fountain, which they spread themselves in breadth over Dotham, even at Belmem, and the length from Bethulia unto Cinnamon, which was over against Estrelon. Now the children of Israel, when they saw the multitude of them, they were troubled. They were greatly troubled, and said every one to his neighbor, now will these men lick up the face of the earth? Neither the great mountains, nor the valleys, nor the hills are able to bear their weight. Then every man took up his weapons of war, and when they had kindled fires upon their towers, they remained and watched all night. So essentially, they're watching their, to see what kind of, moves these people are gonna do, right? So they're just being circumspect, essentially, right? And it says here, verse 5. Verse 6, and it says, and the second day Holofernes brought forth all his horsemen, and in the sight of the children of Israel, which were in Bethulia, and viewed the passages to the city, and came near the fountains of their waters, and took them, and set garrisons of men of war over them, and he himself removed towards his people, right? So there was a passageway, that, we were using those fountains. And what is something you get from fountains, right? So this was a passageway they would use, us being the children of Israel, and then they were using, this as essentially as a resource to, like what people use water for. Water is used to actually, for drinking, for showering, for essentially daily necessities, cooking, so on and so forth. But this is what Holofernes did. Holofernes set garrisons of men of war, and they stationed them in a particular portion of that, of that passageway. So what is a garrison? Just to get an understanding of what's going on here. Let me go to this here. Let's look up the word garrison just for edification. So a garrison is the troops stationed in a fortress or town to defend it. So essentially, they were stationed near the fountains of their waters, and right, so they had men stationed and put in a specific spot to basically defend these particular fountains and waters, right? So just like I said before, they now have men, speaking of the Assyrians and their army, now they have men that are controlling these resources. So essentially Jay can get to these particular resources like they used to be able to, right? So now you're in a pickle, right? Now you're in a serious pickle because now you have people who are experiencing some thirst. They can't eat, like they can't eat and enjoy certain pleasures as they used to, right? They can't drink. These are because water is one of those things that's one of the principal things of a man's life. As a matter of fact, since I mentioned that, let me just grab that in Ecclesiasticus. This is Ecclesiasticus chapter 39 verse 26, and it says here that the principal things of the whole use of man's life are water, fire, iron, and salt, flour of wheat, honey, milk, and the blood of the grape, and oil, and clothing. So these are particular things that you need for your everyday life: water, fire, iron, salt, flour of wheat. So you have grains, you have a field, you beat the grains, you crush the grains, and then you actually get your flour, your honey, your milk, your milk from the sheep or the goat, the blood of the grape, you have your wine, the oil, and the clothing, right? So these things are very, very principal, important things for a man's life, right? For daily necessities. But what did Holofernes do with his men? They stationed men around this, so now Jake can access the resources as freely as they used to. And think about this also in the spirit of what Esau is doing to today. For example, you have this guy, the head of Microsoft, for example, like Gates. What they have been doing is I think even Zuckerberg as well, if I'm not mistaken, as well, because I believe he bought some some property in, I believe it was Hawaii, and he was building bunkers. But nevertheless, really the point is, they were, what Gates was doing, was buying up a bunch of farmland, right? Because they actually want to be able to control the resources, right? So people, so what does that do? It also destroys people's autonomy, right? So it's really, as the scriptures say, there's nothing new under the sun. So this is what these heathens have been doing for a very long time, and this is one of the tactics that the Assyrians did. Instead of you're trying to get people into subjection. So what is the a sharp way of trying to get people to be compliant is to control the resources, control the food, control the grains, the bread, things that people, be able to, people need for their everyday life, right? And that's the same idea is what they want to do with their technocracy system, with their MOTB system. It's the same idea, right? So let me continue reading. Let me go back to the story. Let's see here. What was I? Okay, I'll read from verse 8 here. And it says here, "Then came unto him of all the chief of the children of Esau, and all the governors of the people of Moab, and the captains of the seacoast, and said, Let our Lord hear a word, that there be not an overthrow in thine army. For this people of the children of Israel do not trust in their spears, but in the height of the mountains wherein they dwell, because it is not easy to come up to the tops of their mountains." So it shows that, these other nations had more insight or had more intel in regards to, the kinds of warfare, how they fought, what type of God did they serve, why their God hates wickedness, what kind of wickedness is their God hate. They had a lot of insight on you Israelites. But when it comes to our people, they're always in a state of constant mirth and folly, to the point where you don't see the detrimental effects of what happens, when you stay around these heathens. You're trying to be buddy buddy with these heathens. These heathens actually are seeking to destroy you, just like in the story here. Our people don't see the value in, like I mentioned earlier, knowing the history, and then knowing who your enemies are, and then knowing also of how your enemy fights. He's gathering, because they know all the intel on you. All right, they know your descendants, they know where you come from. And it's funny enough, when you speak to people from like the East, the so-called Middle Eastern region, today, they know a lot more. They know a lot more, especially in the East, like places like Russia and so on and so forth. They know a lot more about, Jake's history than Jake. Jake is always, the last to know. you know um and it says here, verse 12, I'm sorry, verse 11. It says, therefore, my Lord, fight not against them in battle array, and there shall not be much as one man of thy people perish. Remain in thy camp, and keep all men in thy army, and let thy servants get into the hands of the fountain of water, which issueth forth of the foot of the mountain. So, because they understood that, Jake was coming to use the fountain. So if they block off the fountain, then, they eventually would starve them out. So because the goal is to really have them in subjection, is to have you Israelites in subjection, right? So here it says, verse 13, and it says, for all the inhabitants of Bethulia have the water thence, so shall thirst kill them, and they shall give up their city, and we and our people shall go up into the top of the mountains that are near, will camp upon them, to watch that none go out of the city. So they and their wives and their children shall be consumed with fire, and before the sword come against them, they shall be overthrown in the streets where they dwell. Thus shalt thou render them an evil reward, because they have rebelled and met not thy person peaceably. And these words pleased Holofernes and his servants, and he appointed to do as they had spoken. So they were coming up with a bunch of, unrighteous decrees to try and conquer your Israelites. Like, this is why, this is why it's all, this is war, right? This is physical war, speaking of, but that concept still remains to this day. Because if you look at things spiritually, when you look at our nations and our nation, in tethers, what the other nations are doing, especially Esau today, they come into your lands, they covet your fields, they take them by violence, and then they take in all your resources. So now you don't benefit. A good example is what Shell did. When you read about the story of like what the Shell, the gas company, did in Nigeria, they used the military, the very own Nigerian military, which was comprised of majority of our people, and they use it to fight against the locals, right? They destroyed the land, they contaminated the land, right? But our people were the last to profit from that land, because Shell was constantly extracting the resources, because Esau really is, not only is he the type of person that likes to sow discord, but he takes peace from the earth, right? He covets, he takes all the resources, and he tries to hoard everything for himself, because really he's a niggard, right? So continuing on here, This is verse 17. And so the camp of the children of Ammon departed with them 5,000 of the Assyrians, and they pitched in the valley and took the waters and the fountain of waters of the children of Israel. And then the children of Esau went up, and the children of Ammon, and camped in the hill country over against Dothan. And they sent some of them to the south and toward the east over against Ecrabel, which is near Chusi, and that is upon the brook of Machmor. And the rest of the army of the Assyrians camped in the plain and covered the face of the whole land. And their tents and carriages were pitched to a very great multitude, right? So essentially, and Jacob eventually they began to cry unto the Lord, they make their supplication. And in the 8th chapter, then that's when they realize, and that's when, you really get introduced to Judith, who actually understood, she understood what was going on from a spiritual lens and perspective, because she understood it was a trial, and it was an opportunity for us to get closer to the Lord through actually being, tried, right? So, but really the point of this lesson is to understand how the actual heathens and their mindset works in regards to conquering our people, because one of the good things to take away from this is to understand that they had a lot more intel on you Israelites rather than our people actually knowing, I should say it like this. They knew a lot of intel, but, our people don't see the value in knowing their own history, right? And I wanted to let me read this here in Baruch, actually. Because starting with our apostles and elders on down, Jake doesn't seem to understand and value their history, and they don't seem to value understanding that they have, like, you have enemies, right? Where is it? Where's Baruch? 1 second. Oh, here we go. This is, where is it? This is Baruch chapter 4, verse 1, and it says, "And this is the book of the commandments of the Most High, and the law that endureth forever. And all they that keep it shall come to life, but such as shall leave it shall die." And it says, verse 2, "And turn thee, O Jacob, and take hold of it, and walk in the presence of the light thereof, that thou mayest be illuminated." So being illuminated and understanding who your enemies are, that is part of knowing, and knowing also how your enemy fights, knowing them, knowing their history, knowing, you have to become, like Apostle Gabar did a lesson about the levels of intelligence, being there's owls and dragons, and there is monkeys, parrots, understanding, because that makes you wiser, and Jake likes to pride themselves in in being ignorant. There's nothing attractive about that. We come from a lineage of kings and priests, and these people were very, very knowledgeable, right? But scriptures say that we have an unction from the Holy One to know all things, right? So that's pretty much the point, I wanted to hit, because I know it just gives you insight to how the heathens were thinking, right? And then understanding, how they were trying to design to conquer us. And then you had Esau and Moab. They were more like opportunists to try and, to basically give a layup to our downfall, right? So I just thought I would make a lesson on this. I just thought it was very interesting in regards to their different war tactics and how they were seeking to conquer our people during this time. But I'll leave the lesson there. But Lord's will, this lesson was edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh B'Shem Shai. Till next time, I say Shalom.